So hopefully all 6 of our values are present and operational every Sunday in some way or another. But every now and then it's good to highlight each one of them and their particularities. At least once a year, I hope to deal with each of them exclusively, which in fact is not entirely possible because they are really organically interacting with and drawing from one another. Be that as it may, today we make inquiry with our value of pluralism. Pluralism is not a particularly religious-sounding word. It sounds academic at best. But in a Unitarian Universalist setting, something that sounds entirely scholarly becomes, in fact, and indeed, sacred. We are magic in that way. Okay, so these values are housed in the association's bylaws, also not a particularly sacred-sounding text. Nonetheless, there they are in Article 2. It starts off, love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. Inseparable, from one another, these shared values are JETPIG. What's JETPIG? All right. Gold stars all around. So Article 2 describes each value, describes the value, and then promises to do something about it. So, for instance, pluralism reads, we celebrate that we are all sacred beings, diverse in culture, experience, and theology. That's the description of pluralism. And then it says, we covenant to learn from one another in our free and responsible search for truth and meaning. We embrace our differences and commonalities with love, curiosity, and respect. So first off, sacred beings, the description of our equity value, different value, still uses the vocabulary of worth from our old first principle to describe us humans. And you should probably know by now that I'm not a fan of the word worth to describe humans in a capitalistic society. I like to substitute holy whenever I see the word worth. But pluralism, I don't have to do that. It nails it. Sacred beings. Yes, how I love that one of our values observes us as sacred. Not just worthy or dignified, which to my ears sounds like a stuffed suit at a Victorian economics lecture, but sacred. I mean, look around at the sacred beings that are here with you right now. I love that we are using religious language in a religion. That feels good. I could sense the hand-wringing. What does sacred even mean, though? That's such a Unitarian Universalist worry. It's why I love us. Sometimes I do wish we could just use parlance without interrogating it. Just, you know what I mean, through words laden with baggage. But that's not who we are. We are a critical tradition. And wrestling with words and concepts is actually really fun. So I had my own fun and came up with what I think sacred means. You might have a different take, which is fine for the most part, because pluralism, right? So anyway, I'm going to go with a definition of sacred that is something like Sacrality is a measure of meaning and love. Something sacred, imagine something sacred to you, is something either imbued with or communicating deep, deep meaning and love. And just circling back, if we are celebrating that we are each sacred beings, that would mean that we are beings of deep, deep meaning and love, which is both obvious and wonderful if we slow down enough to understand it at all. Anyway, sacred beings is a wonderful start, and we're all sacred. Everyone. Even him. Which just goes to show you that being sacred by itself does not mean that we're right. Or even particularly on track. Love does not equal accurate. Nor, weirdly, does love equal benevolence. Even love needs parameters, a course in which to flow. It's the distinction between a river and a flood. How do we know our meaningful love is accurate and benevolent? Well, that is an epistemological question, and that is fitting. Our value of pluralism preserves one of our former principles, the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And that is an epistemological standard, or at least an attempt at one. Okay, epistemology is a big word. I like big words. What it means is, it's from epi, the Greek epi, which means over, like epidermis, and ste, S-T-E, which is a Greek root for stand. So overstand, which sounds weird, but makes a little sense while also highlighting how weird the word understand is. That makes less sense, and we use it all the time. So overstand. Epistemology is the study of how we know what we know. Theology, the study of the divine. Geology, the study of the earth. Epistemology is the study of how we over or understand, the study of how we know, and it helps us to know if what we think is true, or at least accurate. And that helps our knowledge to not be in self-service, to not be narcissistic. And we are currently in an epistemological crisis. Because the internet and capitalism has destroyed or corrupted our former flawed epistemological guardrails. The epistemological crisis is as responsible as anything else for why we are where we are as a national body politic. When something sounds sensical, how do we know it's true? Even when we have an experience, how do we know that we're not just loopy? That is the purview of epistemology. And I have long wanted a Unitarian Universalist epistemology. We used to have what we call the sources. You could actually find them in the back of or the front of the teal hymnal ahead of you. Don't read it now because it's really long. And because of that, I don't think they really cut it as an epistemology. I always appreciated, to some extent, or like looked on with envy, the Wesleyan Quadrilateral, which, Wesley was the founder of Methodism, and they had this epistemological quadrilateral, which is if something happens, if you want to know it's true, you check with scripture, you check with tradition, you check with your own reason, and you check with experience. It's got to meet a level of truth standard in all of those. There's also the three jewels of the Buddha, the Sangha, and the Dharma. So if you're a Buddhist and something happens or you want to test a truth, you consult the story of the Buddha or your own inner Buddha. You consult the Sangha, which is the community, and you consult the Dharma, which is the teachings, both of the Buddha and later doctrines. Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path, etc. So we had our sources, but again, that's more of a flood than a river. They listed everything. So I think pluralism, compared to our old sources, is a step better. It may not be a fully fleshed out epistemology, but it's both better than nothing and better than everything because it's not specific, which I know is somewhat counterintuitive, but I think we benefit by it being a value rather than a list of sources. As a value, pluralism warns that if your assumptions are operating in isolation, you may be in trouble. If your opinion is the only opinion in the room, you might be in trouble. Pluralism prevents a totalizing univision. It checks narcissism. It rebels against theocracy and tests orthodoxy. It is fundamentally anti-authoritarian. And so, if not a full-fledged epistemology, pluralism is an epistemological guardrail. That said, it does not mean that all opinions are equally valid. It does not mean that all opinions are even particularly acceptable. Rather, it tests them, both thoroughly and compassionately. Because in our context especially, pluralism is shaped by love, curiosity, and respect. It says it right in Article 2. In other words, pluralism has limits. Chief among them is harm. Pluralism is both liberatory, because it gets us out of our own narcissistic thought trains and helps others do the same, so it's liberatory, but it's also normative at the same time, which means it kind of gives us rules to live by. So it does both of those things, which is a pretty spectacular thing for a value to do. And it's just good policy. But that's just policy. How does it become spiritual? If spirituality is the ability to feel and experience connection, how does pluralism connect? How does it become sacred? If sacrality is a measure of meaning and love, how does pluralism help us develop our sense of meaning and love in the world? I think this is how. I think we put it back into the intercoursing matrix of our values, JETPIG. We base pluralism in love and recognize that pluralism reveals necessarily interdependence. In honoring diversity, we draw upon equity. Putting ideas in play with one another will naturally generate transformation. and listening to a multitude of voices is itself a generous act that is also just. So when we scaffold pluralism with the rest of our values, we discover that our certainty is challenged and we become humble. Pluralism invites conversation, which again reflects an implicit theology. After all, life, reality, God is conversation. So we are in resonance with theos and bios when we treat conversation as sacred. We find that pluralism asks us not to just tolerate, but to welcome. Not always to accept, but to be ever curious. It says so right in the Value Covenant. We embrace our differences and commonalities with love, curiosity, and respect. Lastly, I want to leave you with just the ecology metaphor. If you have a monoculture, you plant one crop in a field, a single disease will destroy the crop. One drought, the crop is gone. One challenge, the crop fails. It is a fragile and unsustainable, and unfortunately, the system that we rely on for our agriculture model. But the forests teach us something different. The prairies teach us something different. They teach us that strength is in diversity, that power is in pluralism. In fact, what that means is that pluralism is life. With those snaps, I'd ask you to please rise and body your spirit.